Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Department of Architecture lecture series. My name is Nasser Rabat, and I am the Aga Khan Professor here at the Department of Architecture and the Director of the Aga Khan Program for Islamic Architecture. Redressing a wrong starts by acknowledging it. So here is MIT's land acknowledgement. MIT acknowledges indigenous peoples as the traditional stewards of the land and the enduring relationship that exists between them and their traditional territories. The land on which we sit is the traditional unceded territory of the Wampanoag Nation. We acknowledge the painful history of genocide and forced occupation of their territory. And we honor and respect the many diverse indigenous people connected to this land on which we gather from time immemorial. I am very happy to introduce my friend and colleague Ikem Stanley Okoye, who will give this joint Aga Khan Program and Department of Architecture lecture tonight. I will begin with an old story, a first impression, and an admission. Until September 1985, I thought the word cool meant a physical condition of things that is the opposite of hot. Then in early September of 1985, a bunch of us second-year PhD students then at the HTC program here at MIT were sitting in a kennel. This is the name we so lovingly give to our collective office when the new students arrived. Among them was a suave and eloquent man who spoke in a distinct London accent, Ikem Okoye. He was starting his PhD on the architecture of West Africa, a topic that was never studied in HTC before. Ikem and his topic were natural allies to those of us who were grappling with the then current notions of post-structuralism, post-modernity and its discontents, neoliberalism and its challenges, and most importantly, post-coloniality. We obviously became friends, and I learned the true meaning of cool. Ikem graduated from MIT and started his academic career teaching at Northwestern University before he ended up at the University of Delaware in 2000. He holds there a joint appointment in the Art History Department and the Africana Studies Department, formerly the Black American Studies Program. He has served as director of the African Studies Program and is a member of the Delaware Design Institute. Ikem has held fellowships at the Institute for Advanced Study Princeton and the Center for Modern Oriental Studies in Berlin, among many other fellowships. His essays on architecture, art, and the landscape are widely published in journals. He is currently a Mellon researcher with the Canadian Center for Architecture in Montreal, working on the Centering Africa project in relation to his writing project called Where Was Modernism? His work has previously focused on the African architecture of early colonial Nigeria, and is the subject of the long in process forthcoming book, Hideous Architecture, which will come out from the respected publisher Brill in Leiden in Holland. Another book in the making has a wider artifactual breadth that is exploring sculpture, diminutive architecture, and landscapes of West Africa in the latter years of the transatlantic slave trade and its immediate aftermath. With the preliminary title, Fetish Landscape Architecture, this work asks questions about how we have grappled with the definition of architecture, such that it brings us to the troubling place in which Africa comes to be represented neither in the history of architecture nor in landscape history, even when these histories are globally thought. Ikem's lecture tonight is entitled Elusive Things, Materialities and Spatialities in the Vicinity of Niger. And it sums up for me his approach that he developed over the last 30 years of scholarship and takes me back to his passionate yet laid back and confident arguments of graduate studies days. Surmounting the reading of historical architecture through the lens of the traditional conceptualizations of space and medium with which architectural knowledge has worked, especially in the Sahel in Africa, but elsewhere as well, Ikem is proposing a critical engagement with dynamic intersections of spatiality and materiality and their forms of situatedness. His proposition is crucial, as conventional architectural histories in Africa are only ever partial, are produced under constraint, and result usually in, and their result are usually left unreliable interpretations of the architectural past to which architects and conservators refer or from which they seek inspiration or direction. An analysis of architecture through the lens of spatiality and materiality, as Ikem suggests, offers better ground for historical reconstruction as well as contemporary architecture and conservation. This might be especially true if we do so while imagining the possibility of architectures and historiographies of decoloniality. Please, Ikem, sorry about the delay, and now the floor is yours, or the screen is yours.
Hello, everyone. In the big wide world, I'm sure with webcasting, we might have people who are very local and people who are in here from a significant distance. Thank you very much, Nasser, for that introduction, which sort of took me back quite a while to our younger days. It feels like such a long time ago. I'd also like to say that I'm really happy to be sort of back at MIT. I wish I was there physically back, sort of re-experience Cambridge and Boston, and of course, engage with other members of the architecture department who are acquaintances and friends, including Carolyn Jones and Arundel Dotter, and probably a few others that I could sort of name in a list. So there's a loss from the pandemic that forces us to use this medium as the way to be at MIT for this talk. But enough said, and I'll just jump straight into my lecture. And to do that, you all have to bear with me because I first of all have to share my screen. The geographic Sahel has for millennia produced knowledge that forces us to think about human situatedness, in part because we are yet to grasp adequately what the Sahel knows. Hosting ancient urbanisms that archaeologists Susan and Roderick McIntosh especially suggest coincide with the earliest urbanisms of pre-dynastic Egypt and the city-states of the Near East. They were and are still metropolitan and diverse, permissive in ways that European cities would become intolerant of. Its indigenous peoples did not, for instance, regard transhumance as an early phase in a progress towards settlement. Here, there were no Egyptians, as Europeans once called the still despised traveling Romani of the EU. Sahelian societies' relationship to mobility, like the flux of spatial occupation, leads us to distrust the idea of space as territory bounded by physical things that enforce spatial fixity, flows, forms, volumes, and shapes. Perhaps then, ours is a kind of failure to read space as, quote, the ongoing possibility of a different inhabitation, as Elizabeth Grosz puts it, writing from Outside Architecture. And incidentally, these two images you see on the screen are from somewhere I went to school, from my high school, and in a way I would consider my hometown. So it was a bit of a shock when I actually discovered these things online. Grace Thurrock. The inability to read is what contributes representation, so easily characterizing the Sahel as unstable, harsh, and inhospitable. A zone of difficulty is dissonant actually with how Sahelians themselves know their world. If difficult it is, they understand it largely as a crisis of the history of its peoples during and since European colonialism, and maybe I'll go back to this map, and the inflexible border protocols of the 20th century post-colonial state. Priorly, the Sahel was not only a major space for transcontinental exchanges, but also contained densely networked zones of luxuriant life. Crucially, though, there were no monumental buildings of religious function in the ancient histories, suggesting that its city-states were sites of patrician or communitarian, if not even democratic government, perhaps with enforceable laws and territories that could be defended, either in reality or at least in a lost mythology. My talk today is in 4 parts, mainly engaging buildings in relation to what is elusive about them as space, material, and conductors of time. The first part asks questions about Sahelian openness towards new possibilities of inhabitation, and whether our architectural techniques can capture this in time, especially with regard to gender, for instance. It also briefly explores an early 20th century building with regard to modernity, materiality, and incorporation. The second part explores a newly engaged patronage mechanism. Part 3 explores the architecture these systems have produced and is a critique of its raced discourse via a new form of historicism and a racialization of opportunity strangely justified in relation to local culture and history. I begin to suggest how its procedures might invisibly be driven by what separately Jane Bennett and Jason Dittmar, and perhaps even Alfred Gell, of blessed memory, might recognize as material agency. In our case, the agency of soil, from which big, maybe elusive, things called buildings are produced. The last part, more rhetorical than declarative, explores a selection of contemporary buildings. Turning something on its head, though, I will wonder whether dirt, the soil, the stuff that constitutes buildings doesn't here in the Sahel, after all, make the things we call architects and not the other way around. Over time, Sahelian cities have changed with the slow conversions of its peoples to Islam starting in the 9th century. Deeper social and political hierarchies appear, including the insertion by the turn of the 14th century of institutional buildings when structures that stood out from the generality of mixed-use merchant residences first begins to occur. We know better than to read this image by René Caillé, a print from a lithograph, as if it were unmediated, but can note this first European visitor's depiction of monumental buildings representing Timbuktu's oldest mosques. And by the way, Timbuktu is not an ancient city. In the image, we see no market, even though at upper right hand, a caravan can be seen entering the city, clear evidence of the importance of trade, both trans-Sahelian and trans-Saharan. Islam also introduced increasingly resilient legal systems for inheritance and maintenance, also securing property in demarcated land and its occupation. Nevertheless, a kind of waiver is allowed to nomadic inhabitation. Sudu remain dispersed across the city, a place of the mix of permanent structures and the always moving ephemeral, the substantial and solid with the transient and impermanent. Transience and permanence constantly shifting in space, constantly shifting space itself. And certainly Kaye seems to recognize the significance of things elusive and transient in not rendering Sudu invisible in the manner of their contemporary erasures in the present day media. Insisting on their presence, Kaye exaggerates, depicting the Fuller house as larger than life next to the permanent buildings with which they jostle. This way of being constitutes its own logic for the spatialization of property and for the relationship between space and gender. Although we cannot know Sahelian gender dynamics before Islam with certainty, women were as much the subjects of art as were men, which says something, surely, about equality. What we do know is that Timbuktu, a more recently founded city than Jenne, where these objects come from, in Timbuktu, landed property was mainly in the hands of men, while for both Muslim and non-Muslim Pearl of Fuller, that which made transhuman living possible, movable property, was owned by women, while livestock was owned by male-led clans, which entailed for men a sort of disinterest in property and land. Indeed, this was the Fulani Pearl ethos and was shared by those sections of Tuareg or Amazigh circulating the same spaces. Sahelian cities were thus places through which significant populations daily transited, and so we cannot bring the notion of public space segregated by gender to them in the ways we might elsewhere. Grasping this demands more than the approaches available to us can deliver. As scholars and or practitioners of architecture, we have, and certainly I have, brought to our mapping driven understanding the privileging of planar representations of space, uncertain how to merge that to equally crucial phenomena, from the immediacies of loitering, street hawking, and the social networks of telephone and cell phone use, to more global practices of movement, mobility, and especially time and time's extensions, for which we have no representational clue what to do about. The limits of our phallocentric mappings are far more likely to produce an apparent containment of women, their apparent absence from represented space, than is actually true. Architecture misses these repeatedly, but temporarily blocked off streets, occupied for hours by events of interest to women, which they organize, control, and enthusiastically participate in, betrothals, celebrations of a birth, or success in trade and commerce, amongst others. Our maps are blind too to women's impermanent shops in the streets close to their homes, or their gatherings in spirit possession practices, or bori, studied most recently by Adeline Mascalier, which appear and then vanish with barely a trace. This is not even to note the pastoralist women are also just as likely to be moving around in the space of the town than are the women of sedentary families. Similarly, we misread and misread still the lives of those in transit today, Sahelian or not, and continue to pache the relatively new work of Haruna Munakaila, Musa Kalam Mamadou, and Usaina Alidu, among others, currently studying for Agadez how the trans-Saharan refugee or economic migrant once again challenges, as indeed de rigueur, the mechanisms of temporary occupation and movement as having for millennia been the city's raison d'etre. In its processes, the women of Agadez come to the fore as merely playing the roles they always had in the informal arrangements, providing support for people in transit. An absolutely stunning reordering of the dynamics of visibility and invisibility, in some ways illuminating the related operations of public space visibility regulation engaged in by migrants, nomads, and women alike. Their intersections with, say, non-pastoralist, non-transhuman Hausa women, for instance, included. I hope you recall that the Kai image depicted Fulani peoples everywhere. Today, they erect their temporary structures in vast numbers at the edges of the city instead, suggesting indeed that colonial law and its undergirding of legality in the post-colony has produced exactly the dilemmas of opacity or visibility to the state's will to assess and scrutinize that Abdulmalik Simonet speaks of in relation to other kinds of movement just mentioned. Whereas the migratory movements of the refugee present appear for the same reason to opt for a kind of retrenchment. Our concepts of space also imply containment without a convention that accounts for the impermanent nature of the container. When the material from which space is framed is subject itself to decay, when time is admitted to space, earth slowly melting if abandoned, back sometimes over decades into the ground. Architectural representations in relation to buildings, which will shortly concern us more directly, has not fared much better capturing this. Considering invisibility and inhabitations that produce space specifically in relation to buildings, our mapping also fails to capture the procedures of new architecture as incorporations into existing fabric. In fact, it can miss newness as such, perhaps blinded in this context by the monochromatics of buildings completely when built of the soil. I shall address this shortly, but first should mention that our representations do not take note of what I think, I can only think to describe as an ecology of decaying buildings and their significances for local culture, at least as displacements of momentary flows. It has also not explored or represented earth or dirt as a concept either, considering that dirt is a common idea meaning soil and is separate from the dirt in dirty when we mean something unhygienic, which is where architectural discourse and theory tends to go. However, it will become clear that what produces the most visible phenomenon of contemporary architecture in the Sahel has to do precisely with earth, soil, clay, and dirt. The alive agent I have already hinted at. One is, after all, born of earth, lives in earthen houses, surrounded by earthen objects, pottery, and so on. One also had religious experience around deities, such as the images I've already just shown you, produced from the same earth, And when one expired, well, on the evidence of pre-Islamic Jenne, one returned to Earth in large earthen vases. How can we grapple with Earth as life itself, with Earth as alive, in fact, an actant or agent in the world? Well, I wish I had an answer, but I will try and approach this issue indirectly. Sahelian urbanism, its dense villages and towns, its cities, are well practiced in inventing and incorporating the new, actually. Earth as actant in Sahelian negotiations of change, including modernities, both locally invented and borrowed, is exactly what in part enabled a specific kind of non-seeing recently by UNESCO that reveals a certain possibility, and I'm sort of speaking about UNESCO, the UN organization connected to the UN. For now, note that in the past decade or so, UNESCO has designated whole parts of several cities as heritage sites in which, whoops, it's the cemetery with the person buried in a vase, in which nothing new can now be inserted, misreading, in fact, Timbuktu, Jenne, and Agadez as historical relics in need of preservation, while paradoxically hoeing oppositely to Sahelian cultures of memory, a variety of intangible heritage that their mandate also suggests they should preserve. For Sahelian people, neither memory nor history necessarily inheres in the physicality of an object, nor in materiality as such. The great mosque at Jenne, which I had just shown you in this image, there we go, which is now, in fact, an early 20th century building, because it's a reconstruction from this image that you see of its dilapidation, being a good case in point. So architecture or memory? This is the question that Earth as agent might help us with. Part 3. I rehearsed the UNESCO story in Agadez elsewhere, but put briefly, it was not locally instigated, but rather emerged from French proto-colonial and colonial romanticism and its myths, some circling Amazighi peoples. Amazighi or Imagazen are the popularly known Tuareg of the English language, the blue-veiled sailors of the Sahara. I mean that although local politicians and officials of the Nigerian state preferred another city, Zander, for the World Heritage Site honor in relation to history, but the UNESCO paradigm eroded that local agency, enforcing Agadez's priority. UNESCO's consultants and collaborators were Crater, which is Earth studying and scientific architecture connected section at the University of Grenoble in France. And though they could be regarded somehow as problematic in the story, I hope you will see that what we pursue is how perhaps they were merely dirt's secret weapon. Few scholars have worked on Agadez's architectural history since the 1950s, and I speak of architectural history very specifically. LaBelle Proussin, an American pioneer, did in the late 1960s. Nevertheless, her book, whoa, more images of Agadez. Nevertheless, her book, Hatumer, spends barely 4 pages on Agadez, in one of which she addresses the interior of a house. and a location with a bowl on it that you can see. And she speculates that it is a simulated Tuareg bed that also refers to other nearby cultures. For her, we look at a trace of an Amazi nomad becoming sedentary. Here, an audience chamber is their masonry house, the center articulated by pillars enclosing an earthen plinth, evoking the easily dismantled wooden Tuareg bedstead of the desert travelers. For her, a settled Amazi patron, evoking the desert life in solid clay. In fact, however, this space occurs deep into the building on the second floor, far from any reception area. Later, the text goes on to speak of what this interior also takes from another building, a more recent structure that is supposedly built by Hausa immigrants to Agadez from southern Niger or even Nigeria, who refer to its Berber heritage. This second house, she says, reveals a Hausa builder's meeting the preferences of a transformational Tuareg patron. In fact, however, she represents two images that are of the same building. The exterior marking the entrance to the building with the faux bedstead. By chance, this house actually becomes a prop in Italian director Bernardo Bertolucci's Sheltering Sky, based on American novelist Paul Bowles's book, both plotting the travels and travails of a well-heeled American couple, Kit and Port, Deborah Winter and John Malkovich, using trans-Saharan travel to explore their relational difficulties, while also revealing some of the complexities of European life, or in this case, American life in Africa during the immediate post-colonial era. My Mac is asking me to tune up or something. Halfway through the film, Port takes ill and dies. Kit, widowed, distraught, and grieving, is rescued by a caravan on its way to Agadez, and during which the merchant slowly enters into a sensitive relationship, ultimately sexual, with a disoriented Kit. The clip I will show now is of the caravan arriving in Agadez, at the end of which Kit is disguised in a turban and gets smuggled past the women folk of the Tuareg household, camouflaged as an honored male guest. And I want us to watch it because it tells us something interesting about the house itself. And given the technologies we have to cope with, I have to stop share and pull up the clip and then share the screen again. Portion. Oh, I'm becoming a pro. Whoops, is that it? No, not quite. Oh yeah, maybe this is it. Yeah, so here we go. Okay, let us get out of the film and re-expand to the size of the screen, if it will let me do that. No, maybe I have to actually stop share and go back. Hello, everybody again, and go back and then re-portion and reshare to, no. Oh, there we go. So you would have noticed that there is no bedstead there, in fact, but instead a rectangular void, pillars at corners, and edged by a balustrade. A hole in the floor, looking down at the level below, a spatial perforation that Bertolucci exploits. I mentioned that the house lies in the World Heritage Site Historic Center that includes the Friday Mosque and the Sultan's Palace in Agadez. With these two, this house is now a cherished third part of ancient history, and yet, in fact, it is practically modern. The absence of a bedstead is especially significant, however, because it alerts us to local knowledge's reliability, since it asserts that the house was commissioned by a foreigner, not by someone Hausa or Fulani or Songhai or Jerma or Tuareg Amazighi. The house was commissioned by a merchant owner, quote, from Dakar in Senegal. They say, and not by a local Tuareg. It is far from ancient, moreover, having been erected in 1917, a key year in local history that marks the pacification of Agadez, when French forces, possibly including infantry from Senegal, were ordered to massacre a large number of locals, stridently rejecting impositions by the colonial state. The patron may, I think, even have arrived here as part of the colonial force. However, the house is also known as the House of Sidi Ka, implying someone who was or descended from a Senegalese marabout. Either scenario, marabout or suspect boulanger, Poussin, because it's also called the baker's house, Poussin nails it when she writes that the actual builders, and likely one of the builder's wives at least, were in any case Hausa. It is certainly not sign alone of an autonomous Amazighi creativity expressing the nostalgia for tents in a tradition away from the French nomadist romanticism that gave rise to the preservationist impulse. The early Earth House of Sidika has successfully, the All Earth House of Sidika has successfully inserted itself into a narrative of Agadez's ancient history, despoiling UNESCO's authenticity right under its nose. It's not, okay. Part 4. How do earthen buildings work on building practices in the Sahel since 1989? Unexpectedly, perhaps we are spoiled for riches. Casting the vicinity of Niger as a place in need of rescue without questioning French culpability in colonialism sets in motion an assembly in which the Sahel becomes a ground where white, often young and typically European, less often American, architects cut their teeth while giving local populations a leg up out of disadvantage. But there is, we shall see, nevertheless, something unsettling about the privileging of whiteness in these procedures, in which architecture is brought once again to historically distressed Black communities. Simply said, the patronage system that brings white architects to Black Africa is one that converts architecture to aid. Let us explore these configurations of aid a little bit. Only a handful of Black African architects were ever positioned to offer new ideas for architecture in the immediate post-colony, and none in the Sahel as far as I know. A few more are doing so positioned today. Less recognized, given that there is no shortage of locally resident architects in Africa, is that with their limited applause came and comes still a surprising, influential, and persistent parade of white architects. I do not mean the post-colonial modern architecture of white architects working for government and other institutions, as in Manuel Hertz's African modernism, though it is weird to think post-colonial African modernism with hardly a Black person in sight. So it isn't to that I am referring, since there were hundreds of Black African architects producing buildings in the modernist idiom, even in the early 1960s. I speak instead in relation to racial representation, rather about buildings built with soil, where an architect seems politically woke to the specific economic and cultural situatedness of a structure's commissioning. Renzo Piano, 2013, whose emergency child surgery center you see on the screen, for instance. Or work by Francis Kere or Mariam Kamara. Here we have Mariam Kamara. And here Francis Kere. Partly unravel the global north, global south divide. But they are rare. More typical, joining Piano, as well published in the media, are the likes of Leves or Eleve, Architekten, and I don't know, it's Dutch, Eleve might be a game with eleve, as in elevation. In any case, also Laurent Sechot, Orchid Studios, Spanish architect also Albert Faust, as well as artists Not Vital and Alma Zevi, whose wit is present in their humorously named Makaranta School. And it's humorous because Makaranta means school in Hausa, so this is like school. I could give many more examples. Most justify their projects as humanitarian and assert their design's historical sensitivities too. I'm not sure from where the idea of architecture as a form of development aid first arose, but it seems that permanent buildings specifically designed to, at the same time, be affordable, built from local materials, and committed to development was a terribly ambitious idea that on the surface surely risked hubris. In the Sahel, it was instituted by the French group ADAWA, Association for the Development of Traditional African Urbanism and Architecture, working in Ouagadougou in Burkina Faso. Indeed, as long ago as 1983, the at the time still new Aga Khan Program had published a short piece on ADAWA, citing projects in Mauritania and in Burkina Faso, roughly in the same period that the magazine Mima, the journal, also published an earthen house designed by Egyptian architect Hassan Fati for the Nigerian ambassador's residence in Niamey, in Niger, capital of Niger. Perhaps following Adowa's lead, NGOs have proliferated. Some are connected to tertiary institutions and their sectional organizations, such as the Earthen Architecture Program at the University of Grenoble that I'd already mentioned, Crater, who incidentally had, you will recall, subtended the Agadez World Heritage Site status. The vast majority are not similarly connected and vary from the Dutch partners Pays Dogon to LAFI, based in Vienna, and include two modest organizations founded by a single person, such as the Spanish CC on Ayuda de Desarrollo, founded by a Spanish couple on less than $2,000, which then mushroomed by funding its projects twinned to first world tourism. These are mountain climbers in just outside Agadez. All hold close, and so they also have a place to stay that this organization also provides and builds and etc. All these hold close to humanitarian discourse. One who comes clean instead, as we might expect of an artist, is Zevi, who says about his activities in Niger, vital too, I could not even dream of building a school in Europe or the US with all their regulations, but in Agadez, I can. I have this phenomenal opportunity to build something that in most places in the world would be refused me. As Nietzsche says, he continues, friendship is not about taking. Friendship is not giving, but taking. So I take, and so do the children of Agadez. He cannot, she cannot, be unaware of the asymmetry of the taking, let alone of the power relative to children. But he helps us see Mary Mustafa Zened's concept, volunteer tourism, a recent phenomenon that enables interrogations of the ethics of tourism experiences that reveal the expansion of neoliberal moral economies, a climber such as we see in this image, that according to her, co-produce a, quote, geography of compassion that maps onto the third world and the children who live there, unquote. By now, this is quite a sublime phenomenon. Almost every major European nation has several, that is to say, charitable organizations dedicated to or flirting with supporting cooperative projects, unquote, in a predetermined part of Africa, France, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, USA, Spain, and Switzerland. I think I'm running out of time. So I'm just going to not read a few sections of the paper, but just say that I was taking us through the work both of Albert Faust and the work of Eleve, and giving us a sense of how each of these individuals got to be involved in this project, the sort of personal careers and the personal trajectories that brought them to the place they were, and the sort of opportunities that opened up for them in order to sort of get producing earth buildings in these places. Suffice it to say that for Faust, it was Some travel to Ait in Morocco, followed by travel to Bandiagara in Dogon country in Mali. The encounter, I presume, also with Rudowski's Architecture Without Architects, because if you sort of follow the routes of some of the diagrams and photographs in the Rudowski book, these are some of the places that Rudowski's images, and just part of an exhibition, also traveled through. But Faust seems to be at some point seeking for the essential, and he uses that word, for the essential in life, perhaps a protest, in fact, against what I think he was experiencing as the excess of Spanish life in the Barcelona of his home. Lev's is a sort of different history in terms of what sort of brings that particular sort of group of architects to this locale. But their projects are actually quite fascinating, and it's obviously a pity that in the space of the time of a lecture like this one can't actually go more slowly through at least one project to sort of unpack some of the fascinating things about the buildings they had produced and the arguments they make for those buildings. So thinking on my feet, I will just show, oh man, so much good stuff here. I could sort of show this image, which was produced by Faust, in which he's sort of very, very clearly taking photographs of the earth in a way that is clearly aestheticizing the very fabric in which buildings are made from, in his sort of attempt to dig into and retrieve something about the essentiality he's looking for, right? Earth in this context is sort of free building material in a sense. Whereas for the other organization I just mentioned, they sort of build buildings in the way that Dogon peoples in this particular section of Dogon territory. Let's see if I have an image that might do it, not all the perfect one. But here's a sort of aerial view that you sort of look down on. It looks like a sort of strange moonscape of a sort. But if you then begin to sort of zoom in, you see that these outcrops of rock that look like extended ships of an armada sailing through sort of some desert in a direction, that each one of them, like you see this little dot here, is actually a little settlement, a town in short, and they sort of take over one of them and build and make claims about the relationship between a school like this and a Dogon village, right? So in my much more detailed presentation, I would enter into sort of their arguments and sort of show some of their diagrams to sort of give us a sense of the validity, if you like, or not, of the arguments that they put forward. But in the interest of time, as I was saying, and if you sort of can imagine that I'm sort of presenting you with those kinds of additional evidence, I will just, in the interest of time, just jump to my conclusion. Interestingly, outside the world of purely commercial architecture, African architects could appear uninterested in the kinds of projects Europeans and Americans have built in relation to dirt as medium. Much more likely is that this is thanks to unfamiliarity and blocked access and disconnection from the networks of patronage that I've described earlier, and that Francis Kéré figured out first. Another reason is perhaps that from an African futurity that wills full participation in global dialogues and exchanges, not in some regionalist appropriateness, there has been some kind of hesitancy, nor should that surprise us. Recently, Senegalese philosopher Souleymane Diagne, who had once explored the thinking of premier ideologue of negritude, Leopold Senghor, has returned to engaging early 20th century Indian philosopher Muhammad Iqbal in relation to modernity. That is to say that even within African Muslim societies and given the far-reaching transformation wrought by colonialism on culture, the anxiety over modernity is not an angst that many Africans experience or are troubled by in part because they have never not been modern when others were, but also because of some cultures, and certainly that would be true of the Fula and Dogon, that in some cultures, the idea of progress in the way modernists told it seems completely unpersuasive. What they are struggling to establish instead is the power to control their own architectural and urban futures, inserted without either nostalgia or utopia. Indeed, Senegalese architect Mamadou Jean-Charles Toll, practicing in Dakar, has been exploring earth architecture, but also uses similarly sourced local materials for buildings, and mentions a project he is involved in for which his rural clients, and it's not the one I'm showing you here, but for which his rural clients actually rejected his proposal for stabilized earth. And they did so not, as we might think, because of the changing social arrangements that in their hands make maintenance of earth structures more difficult, but instead because it does not project or communicate newness, todayness in their eyes. Another architect who is in the midst of figuring this out is, here's another project by a group organized with J.C. Toll as well, is Nzinga Mboop, founder of Warophilia, now joined by many others, some Black, some white, some connected to Grenoble, and some not. It seems to me that this represents a younger generation fully conversant with what Francis Care's procedures were, and as I understand it, also David Ajayi's too, and because ultimately subject to the agency of dirt itself. I mean that African architects before Earth's eruption, before the eruption of Earth, were more likely displaced from a possible development of their own careers and growth paths by this very present activity of non-local professionals whose successes in the local milieu, absent its invisible mechanisms, appeared mysterious, if not magical. But recently, as these images suggest, Sahelians, especially younger ones, are entering more symmetric partnerships that are increasingly not based on humanitarian largesse. Thank you.
I'm not sure if I'm here or not, but can you hear me, Ikem?
I can see you, yes.
Okay. So my name is Daria Cobb, and I just first wanted to thank you for that wonderful talk. And I am yearning to see the slides that you left out.
It's crazy. I was sort of working and then I realized like, no, thinking about the lectures. And that's the problem, as I'm sure you probably experienced, Daryl, which is that to sort of present material from Africa, one can sort of rely as one might if you were sort of speaking about American architecture and even the most simple familiarity that a listener might have with some basics. So this sort of combines sort of basic level, you know, you have to sort of show everything and even sort of say where the Sahel is and that just fills up the number of images. And I knew I was going to get slow, but I had imagined that I could sort of bump off the descriptions of actual buildings. Actually, each one of which on its own could stand a full critical analysis in a very interesting way. The only reason I actually didn't go for that, no one should ever confess this, is that I'd already written and sent in my abstract. So I realized that at some level, I had to actually deliver what I'd promised.
That's fair enough. Well, addressing the first part of your talk, when we are speaking about architectural histories, engagement or lack thereof with the Sahel and Sahelian architecture, there's there's a lot of question there about the fragility of the methods that one brings to the table as an architectural historian, which you talked about are planimetric, fixity, as well as the inability to account for flows, both in space and in time. And as the talk went forward, it seemed as though there were methods and there are groups of people that have developed more flexible ways of looking at program, essentially, and what needs to be built and why, and not using Earth as a mask for authenticity, but using Earth as a material that's appropriate to the program at hand. And so it actually had a very optimistic tone, I thought, at the end. And I'm wondering if you could talk more about that, so even though we didn't see all of those slides, but the kind of sui generis building upon this sort of erasure in the past, or inability to see in the past, the types of occupation of space through these flows that's now being sort of reconciled and built upon. That what kinds of methods are architects and urbanists using now in the Sahel to see where we wouldn't have seen before?
So sorry, I need a little bit of a clarification. When you say to see, where are we sort of talking in terms of the ways in which architecture might represent? I talked about mapping technologies of the past. I think that architects, and I'd sort of extend that to architectural studies, don't want and don't seem particularly interested, quite honestly, in being confused, say, with ethnographers and anthropologists in these same contexts, right? So some of the ways in which anthropologists and ethnographers work could very easily, so I could sort of imagine actually groups in which you had sort of multidisciplinary groups that would enable the kind of sophisticated description of the Sahel, both in terms of its ideas of space and the ideas of space as they might merge with time, because it's very unfamiliar. It's sort of very different from a sort of Western person's location and understanding of the nature of space in relation to time. So I don't know that I have examples of any of these architects I would have sort of described in detail doing that successfully. In fact, what most of what I was going to sort of suggests is that there's a sort of rhetorical discourse surrounding the projects and their proposals, which are absolutely fascinating, right? You sort of start off and you're like, okay, this group has sort of done the work. They've put in a lot of effort that is not sort of your normal architect sort of site planning. And they've also attempted to sort of connect their project in some ways to the history, the sort of social organizations, and even the sort of formal nature of actual buildings and space in that culture. But the problem is that when one sort of descends into the detail, especially the sort of detail as sort of formed objects, you could sort of very easily imagine that the buildings don't have to be where they are, apart from the fact that they're sort of produced in earth, that the sort of organization of space, the sort of geometries, even if they claim to be sort of based on spatial practices of some of the worlds in which they exist, are really not, right? So it's a kind of front in some way, making a claim that enables a lot of work to be granted them, and until very recently granted them by foundations and funding bodies and NGOs. And they sort of come in from Europe and from the United States and quite often bring young people. So there's young Americans or young Europeans, people who are in college. So there's a sort of positive aspect to it. But then there's this other issue, which is to say that it is really has, and I describe it as magical. It sort of prevented a certain kind of engagement or even of presence of opportunity for African architects in those contexts, right? So I think, this is a long-winded way of sort of suggesting that I'm not sure that I have any examples of architects in these groups. And I actually had several. Many of them are pretty awful, well, I'm not sharing anymore because I sort of just randomly throw one in. Sort of projects yeah, they're sometimes cliched. Sometimes they sort of remind one of a project one might have done, as a thesis project at the end of for architecture programs in which you get a BA after 3 years and then you do an MA. It sort of reminds you of a BA project and some of its sort of almost sort of childish relationship between its understanding of Africa and the culture it's supposed to study. And you even begin to sort of see replications of these ideas the more you delve into the numerous such, and there are many architects doing that work now.
Right.
So what I'm sort of trying to argue is that actually it is interesting that the earth itself is producing this where it wouldn't have once. I mean, there's some benefit being derived by this interest in earth that would otherwise not be produced. So I sort of see earth itself as a kind of agent that's sort of making this happen. And in the process, what's just beginning to emerge is African architects themselves who sort of figure out what this is and are beginning to, and some of them quite honestly are very collaborative, but in which there's no asymmetry, right? The Africans are equal colleagues of the white architects that they work with, who are sort of usually their own generation.
Right.
So this is sort of what I'm trying to understand, sort of how the earth itself is producing that, and that without the sort of power of the earth to do that, we might not be here, because most African architects, as you may know, if you sort of look at the history of post-colonial architecture as such, are really sort of producing high modernist architecture in concrete.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So, I mean, in a way, we're sort of looking at a kind of ironic use of earth in a way, that we're trapped in the material realities of this post-colonial period as a way, and of looking at architecture, right? That the way architecture is funded and built is not flexible and cannot kind of go back and reclaim memory and understandings of space and time that are indigenous to this region, essentially. And so all of what we're seeing now are sort of, it sort of reminds me of a kind of a postmodern game in a way of trying to negotiate this neoliberal landscape of funding and create something interesting, aesthetically interesting out of that. But what we're seeing are entirely new creations with new explanations, essentially, that aren't actually rooted in place. Am I understanding that?
Yes, and it's quite fascinating because, the architects who are involved are what would be the word to describe. They are completely honest about what's sort of driving them. They are completely committed, right? So there's some level of understanding of what they are doing that seems to sort of completely escape the possibility of being grasped. And that's why I thought, well, how does one begin to sort of understand what this process is? You don't go to architecture school if you're not really a smart person, right? You don't end up even sort of figuring out the use of this material in a context if you haven't done the work. But something else seems to escape, and this is why I started to think of that there's a sort of secret force that is driving this with some agenda that we can't quite understand yet, which is why actually I was very hesitant to write a conclusion, because some of the thinking comes from especially Jason Dittmer, who was sort of working on diplomatic architecture in the European context. And he talks about British diplomatic architecture and how paper as a material, and it's a sort of fascinating book, how paper as a material, sort of looking back at early British empire in India, how actually paper, the material, is what produces a certain diplomatic stance of the British state in ways that are very, very persuasive, but one is absolutely assured that in the moment of its occurrence, no British diplomat would have even if he told them, would have even had any way of imagining that all their great sort of diplomatic savvy looked at sort of from a global perspective was really driven by a logic that is simply the material paper and nothing more.
Right.
So I'm sort of trying to imagine that maybe Earth is actually doing that kind of work in this context in a way that its participants don't yet, actually cannot grasp. Even as I speak it and they possibly hear it, it's sort of in a dimension that it's not possible to grasp and to be conscious of while you're inside it, right?
We're in the period of production.
Before this is the puzzle I'm trying to deal with.
Yeah, I mean, when the part of the talk when you were talking about UNESCO and the reification of this material, that is something that is meant to decay in the imaginary of a local culture. That this is sort of the French parallel to the British paper architecture that you were just describing, right? The reification of Earth itself, and is now producing this kind of ironic self-examination.
Exactly. And I think even in relation to mapping, the question you first asked me, a city like Zaria in northern Nigeria, or Kano, or even Zinder, you spend any amount of time in it, and also if you do it as a scholar like I do, and you're sort of looking at old maps, old sort of aerial photographs, you can actually plot a landscape of sort of buildings that are there, that are decaying, and that people sort of walk by and can tell stories about, and it has some, and you sort of think, actually there's something here, right? That there's a kind of acceptance in this world of the fact that things made from Earth decay and then rise again, right? So that the security of a history of a place doesn't depend on the survival of physical buildings. And that's why I think the Djenné Mosque is a perfect example.
Right.
I think it was Jean-Louis Bourdieu studied the history of Jean-Paul Bourdieu, studied the history of the Djenné Mosque, right? In a fabulous article in the journal African Arts, I think it was in African Arts, in which he really, this is very sort of scholarly exploration, shows that, with sort of evidence, archival evidence of photographs and then descriptions of the oral histories of their locales, that absolutely the mosque at Djenné, which is perhaps the most well-known earth building, certainly on the African continent, if it's not the world, is, a building that was produced in the early 20th century, essentially.
Right, that is amazing.
And you can actually see how different it is from the original mosque, to the extent that one can read it through Richard Burton's handmade drawings of the building.
Right.
So it's a transformed building that certainly reflects a tradition, because you can sort of look at smaller mosques in the Sahelian world. You could even look at buildings by non-Muslim peoples like the Dogon or the Mossi or the Bamana, and recognize that it's produced within a tradition that does exist. But for the people of Djenné, that site, the building, it functions every bit as much as the building from the 14th century that it might be a replacement for.
Right.
So that's why I sort of say that the memory and the significance of things isn't dependent on what sort of French Enlightenment thought history is in relation to the actual physical object of the thing.
I should turn, I'm not sure how long they'll let us go on for, but I'll turn to a few audience questions, and also just to encourage audience that is watching to ask questions, and they're being curated for me. I have one from Caroline Jones, who would love to hear your thoughts about the raw and the cooked, the dirt and the brick, and the kinds of complex value systems that are discussed here in relation to Earth architecture.
Sorry, the last one, the kinds of?
The complex value systems in the
value systems.
Yes, yes.
Wow. Trust Caroline. Hi, Carol, if you're watching.
Yes, thank you, Caroline.
You know, the raw and the cooked, we're sort of talking about sort of Lévi-Strauss, right? And the sort of structuralist technique, if you like, for reaching sort of some understanding of the unseen and somewhat, yeah, unseen is a good enough word for sort of understanding the changes in a world or in society. And I bet her question is partly coming, and I thought about this from the very fact that both sort of Jane Bennett's Vibrant Material and Jason Dittmer's, what did I call it? I forgot the title of the book, are in some ways somewhat reminiscent of a sort of structuralist tack. And so the question is, how does that then encounter or impact the sort of values of the moment in which I'm sort of arguing in relation to, perhaps, this may be what her question means, in relation perhaps to sort of African architects in the present and their enthusiasm or not for this material. So how does it? I don't know. I mean, I think that there have been sort of critiques of the structuralist model anyway. So I'd be a little bit hesitant to, despite the assemblage idea, I'd be a little bit hesitant to place the sort of thinking of African architects, if that's what Carrie meant, in that relation, because of course what it does is sort of begins to raise up anthropological perspectives in relation to the primitive and the civilized, for instance, which becomes, I don't know, ground to which these particular practitioners, certainly the African ones, would not deign to be part of or to explain themselves that way. But it might also certainly be true that for the European architects, absolutely there's something about sort of Africa. That's why I sort of think of French Romanticism, right? There's something about African and primitivity that still remains a part of the logic of French thinking, even in the 21st century. And so maybe that question could be best put to those early architects who started this, and actually the patrons, those who are sort of providing the funds for these kinds of projects.
Right.
You know? I mean, I thought of a different kind of paper, but I decided that that cannot be my remit, in which I'd be sort of, because I could be critiqued or criticized, right, for standing against aid, and you know, there are these children who are absolutely happy and thrilled in their neighborhoods where someone sort of come in and build a school. You know, how could you possibly be against, you know? So what I was going to do, but I decided, no, that cannot be the work of a talk like this, especially in sort of architectural history and criticism. But the question is there another way? And this is why I sort of speak about culpability, right? That there's an absence of a proper analysis and understanding of what's sort of producing in the Sahel, the very need for these guys to be showing up.
Right, right. Do you feel that there's a similar cultural romanticism from architects from the non-Sahel, from other parts of West Africa, going into the Sahel and engaging with this landscape? Is there a similar kind of imagining that is brought with a person coming from Dakar, for example, like the house that you showed in Sheltering Sky is being this palimpsest of styles because it's made for a merchant from Dakar? Is there a similar type of encounter that happens for architects working in the Sahel today who are coming from other parts of Black Africa?
Wow, that's an interesting question. I mean, the only architect I can think who's had that kind of opportunity is actually Francis Kere, who obviously starts off in his country of Burkina and gets a few projects, but he's becoming more and more known and getting projects. When I last talked to him in Berlin, it happens to be beyond his own country. And because of the reputation he has for working in earth material, in sort of stabilized earth as his almost signature, he's sort of going into those places and being successful, showing that actually this material is one that can produce buildings that are today, like the issue of todayness, that don't hark back to some distant past that one might be suspicious one is trying to be returned to by the suggestion of this project. But I think that, and actually I gather that David Ajayi, the sort of British Ghanaian architect, who doesn't, you know, if Renzo Piano can build in stabilized, then I guess David Ajayi might at one point.
Right.
But this is not his reputation. And yet I know that he's received, there's a sort of, I don't know, in the last couple of weeks, as a matter of fact, I think he's received a proposal for a project in honor of the martyrs of Burkina Faso. And this project has been, it's sort of produced. But when I sort of looked at the images, the design images, they look like concrete buildings, largely. So he's not doing what Francis Kere is. And to the extent that his ancestry is not Sahelian, it's from further south in the present country of Ghana. He would have been a perfect example of what African architects from other parts of Africa do in the Sahel. But there's very little evidence on which to respond to that question. I mean, an architect like J.C. Tal and Nzinga Mboup that I just mentioned at the end, I mean, one can sort of speak about their work in relation to these issues, because they're also moving away from solely working with stabilized earth and sort of thinking about other materials like that. I mean, locally sourced materials seem to be the big thing for them. But then they too are Sahelian, basically, right? Dakar is in that zone. True. And so they're sort of Sahelians working in their own world. And I know that Mamadou J.C. Tal has sort of traveled, you know, the Sahel is a place of travel after all. And it's very, very likely that in the future, he might get work in other African countries in the Sahel, but it doesn't answer your question, right? What would be great would be like an architect from Angola who sort of got work in Niger, and then we can begin to sort of see what kinds of imagination a person from that world might bring to this place, and not hold or feel necessarily loyal to sort of local traditions and all the mythology about Dogon people.
Right, right. I'm projecting historicism into the next 100 years of what we can hopefully expect to be forward to and writing about. I have a few more questions I'd like to get to, if possible. Let's see. One is from Anne Kaminois. To the extent that crossing the Sahara and setting up camp on its southern shore has periodically been a form of flight from the Mediterranean coast of Africa, is there any evidence of Roman-influenced architecture in cities like Agadez? She asks.
Of Roman? I mean, the Romans were definitely in North Africa, in you know, Libya, in Tunisia. There are sort of great Roman ruins. A fellow architectural historian, Huda Tayoub, who teaches at the University of Johannesburg, recently sort of traveled to, I think it was Tunis, and sort of was shown around one or two sites that were absolutely mind-blowing. So there's a great tradition of ancient Roman architecture that still survives in many parts of North Africa. To the extent that they're present in the sub-Sahara, the answer is absolutely no, except that there are occasionally some, what we might call symbols, maybe. They're sort of small pictorial elements that have been argued. And there's actually a whole book that sort of makes this argument about the Sahara never having been a barrier to the exchange of ideas from north to south and from south to north. Right. But as far as I am aware, and there were once arguments proposed that the very idea of the courtyard in sub-Saharan African architecture, not in the Sahel, but further south, the Yoruba, the Edo of Benin, the Bamum of Cameroon, Ashanti in Ghana. There was once an argument that their courtyards must be sort of Roman, except that, in order to sort of subscribe to that, you'd really end up being like Leo Frobenius, who couldn't grasp the possibility of complexity in architecture and its variety as having been locally produced, a position that has completely been discredited because archaeology begins to sort of show that these are cultures that had similar forms in their architecture. But when sort of looked at in detail, even in terms of the nature of decoration, the uses to which a courtyard is put, it becomes clear that some things get invented in different places in the world that look similar, but it doesn't mean that they're borrowing one from the other. And of course, the other question one might ask, in actually a longer version of this paper, I do ask that question, which is, there was a reason why people in the Sahel weren't the ones sort of crossing the Sahara as far as we know. That's because actually the world they lived in and the sort of trading networks were vast, and it was like living in paradise in some way. It's sort of like, I don't know, Delta ancient Egyptians, with the pharaohs going, what's it called, sort of birding in a way, not birding is not the right word, where they're sort of in the Delta, sort of fishing and hunting birds. These were regions with great bodies of water, with rivers, an easy place to live in, basically. And it seems that for that reason, and of course they had the South below them, which had all kinds of resources, including, most well-known would be gold. And so it seems that, human society in a way generally stays put unless there's some kind of stressor that begins to make people think of moving and exploring places beyond. And I think that what was happening in the North African rim, as it were, stuck between the Mediterranean and the Sahel, is that they needed, because of a kind of really difficulty in that particular context, the mountains in Morocco, for instance, seems to have driven the Amazighi Moroccans south to sort of look for better territory to be in and to derive resources from. So it seems that this sort of contributed at some moment to the fact that it was North Africans, or who we call North Africans today, who made the sort of first exploratory journeys in the, actually quite going back to the 9th century, sort of making that crossing. But sadly, the sort of history of how that happens is sort of lost to us, because it would be fascinating to imagine what sort of drove the first crossing.
Right.
Whether sub-Saharan Africans also went in the other direction before the moment of Islam.
I'm going to end on a question from my colleague Rick Woodstraw, which is it's actually quite quite a difficult question, but I think it's a lovely one that I'd like to end on. And first, she thanks you for the wonderful talk and mentions that, as you have so eloquently put, architectural history as a discipline remains biased against ephemeral and transient building practices, and it instead prefers to examine structures of permanence. What methods and strategies do you think architectural historians have to develop in order to adequately address architecture of impermanence?
Sorry, I missed that word.
What sorts of strategies?
What strategies?
Yes, does the discipline need to develop to address architecture of impermanence, by contrast?
Right. You know, the place the only person that comes to mind who's actually doing interesting work in architectural history in this relation is a friend of mine, to Anuradha Siddiqui, who teaches at Barnard in New York, right? So the kind of work she does, she sort of works on Somali refugees in refugee camps like Dadaab, sorry, and others. And I've sort of seen her speak in some context about her approaches. The one thing I would say is, first of all, that she dissociates herself in a way from some notions of solidity and even of sort of the aesthetics the aesthetic, I don't know, pleasures that we've been socialized to appreciate in certain kinds of buildings. So what this is Anuradha Siddiqui, works with instead is with a sort of, and actually in relation to the very first question someone asked, this would be a good way to respond to that as well, where I started sort of talking about ethnographers, etc. So she sort of and in her case, she's also working with UN refugee support organizations and many others. So she sort of does work in archives and sort of recognizes archival difficulties.
Mm-hmm.
She does oral histories sort of the peoples who are actually both erecting the ephemeral structures and living in them. And so she sort of has a sort of good, almost ethnographic description from the perspective of the local person as to how this place works and what produces change or movement at any point when that occurs. And of course, these are individuals who are sort of constantly, not constantly, but who usually have projects that involve moving away to other places, either back to their original places of origin, or in some occasions sort of travel towards the European continent and the European Union, if they're Syrian or people like that. So I would sort of suggest that and I've seen some sort of fascinating uses of aerial photography, right? So a kind of mixture, and even of sound, right? Of the soundscapes of some of these, there's one called them settlements. She sort of brings them together in interesting ways in which she can then begin to ask certain critical questions about the nature of architecture itself that sort of allows, actually it's a kind of deconstruction, that's basically what it is, of the thing that we've learned to call architecture, because ultimately we're actually sort of talking about time and space. I mean, mm-hmm. that's what it is. So if you sort of think about buildings as a moment, but also a small piece of the much broader thing that we might call practices of space-time in a way. And I wish in the English language there was a word that didn't have to be hyphenated that actually captures the meaning. But I would say that it's that kind of combination of the idea of a sound landscape as something that can be deployed in a description of a space of inhabitation is, and that it might be viewable or audible over time, right? That you can right. actually narrate space through the sort of changing soundscapes is it's a great, it's an idea, and you think like, why didn't anyone have these kinds of ideas previously? I mean, she's not the only one doing that work by any means, but she comes to mind. Yeah. So I don't know if that answers.
Oh, so much food for thought. I wanted to thank you, Professor Okoye, for being here on our ephemeral, dematerialized MIT and discussing all of these amazing ideas. And it's really a pleasure and an honor to see the work in process and to see you moving through the theoretical terrain of the Sahel. And so I'm also honored to be a part of this. So thank you very much for being here.
Thank you. And you can imagine that I'm struggling with what to actually do with research I've already done, because it was absolutely, I mean, I called it phallocentric at the beginning of the talk, but it's absolutely inserted within that universe, and how to now untangle all that and redeploy it through additional kinds of work to really capture what's going on in the way that my friend Husseina Alidu and her group who are working, they're working in Algeria and in Libya. It's a trans-Saharan group of scholars doing this work. Really sort of makes me imagine that some aspects of my own Sahelian work need to be sort of reconstituted, because its foundations are within a universe of mapping that I think needs to be overcome.
Well, thank you very much, Ikem. It was a wonderful lecture. And thank you all, especially Daryl, for managing this question and answer. And goodbye, everyone.
Can you imagine by now we'd just go for dinner and a coffee and all that?
That would be lovely. in the future, yes.
Let us all promise each other that we will do it once. Yes. No, once we are all back together, we will all get together to speak about your lecture and drink for it and eat.
Absolutely. You will all owe me that.
We will. Thank you all again. And thank you, Rix and Courtney and Wesley and Amanda and Daryl for making this a successful event. Thank you all.
Thank you.